For decades, Sweden stood as a beacon of openness, welcoming immigrants from around the world with open arms. But in 2022, everything changed. The country once known as a humanitarian superpower abruptly closed its doors, leaving many wondering what happened to Sweden's famous hospitality. Swedish society has turned against further immigration, with public opinion shifting dramatically. The reason? Well, it is a complex mix of social issues, economic challenges, and concerns about their integration process. This is why Sweden doesn't want immigrants anymore. Sweden's immigration story begins in the late 1970s. Before then, only about 2% of Sweden's population was foreign-born. But that was about to change dramatically. In the decades that followed, Sweden adopted one of the most open immigration policies in the world. The country welcomed refugees and immigrants with open arms, offering them a safe haven and opportunities for a new life. In 1980, Sweden had about 421,000 foreign-born residents. By 2015, at the peak of the European migration crisis, Sweden was taking in 160,000 people in a single year. That's equivalent to 2% of its population. By 2020, that number had gotten to about 1 million. Why was Sweden so welcoming? Well, it was a mix of humanitarian ideals and practical needs. Sweden saw itself as a moral leader, committed to helping those fleeing war and persecution. At the same time, the country needed workers to fuel its growing economy. These people initially came from other Scandinavian countries and Eastern Europe, but as conflicts erupted around the world, Sweden became a refuge for people from much further afield. Large numbers arrived from countries like Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Somalia. Others came from Afghanistan and various African nations. For most of these people, it was the promise of safety that drove them to Sweden. Sweden became known as a place where refugees could find protection from war, persecution, and political oppression. But it wasn't just about safety. Sweden's generous welfare system, free education, and reputation for tolerance also made it an attractive destination for those seeking a better life. For a long time, this influx of immigrants seemed to benefit Sweden. Immigrants filled labor shortages, particularly in sectors like healthcare and services. They brought new skills, ideas, and cultural diversity. Studies in the early 2000s showed that immigration had a positive effect on the Swedish economy. Immigrants contributed to economic growth and helped fill the gap created by the aging population. But as we'll see, this rosy picture won't last forever. Despite the initial benefits, Sweden's open-door policy would soon face significant challenges, leading to the dramatic shift we see today. The diversity caused by such a high influx of immigration came with challenges. As of now, public opinion concerning immigration has shifted dramatically. The flood of newcomers unleashed a wave of social disasters that Sweden was woefully unprepared for. So much that, according to polls by Gothenburg University, the majority of Swedes now want their country to accept fewer refugees. They are furious in Sweden and struggling greatly with the consequences of their open-door policy. The disconnect is not only among the Swedish population, but also Magdalena Andersson, the Swedish Prime Minister from the Social Democratic Party, which has traditionally supported immigration, is fed up. In April 2022, she declared that the integration of immigrants in Sweden had failed, leading to parallel societies and gang violence. But Andersson didn't stop at admitting the problem. She announced a major shift in Sweden's approach to immigration. The new policy aimed to make it much harder to obtain asylum as a refugee. It also included plans to crack down on illegal immigration and restrict low-skilled labor immigration. The era of Sweden's open arms policy was definitely over from this point onward. Sweden felt compelled to make such a drastic change, and there were good reasons for it. In 2023, Sweden accepted 94,514 immigrants. This is the lowest number it has had since 2005, excluding the pandemic years. Prior to then, just between 2013 and 2017 alone, Sweden accepted 533,584 immigrants, which is equivalent to about 6% of its population. This rapid pace of immigration, which outstripped Sweden's capacity to integrate newcomers effectively, is one of the major reasons Sweden is changing their plans. The sudden influx put enormous pressure on housing, education, and social services, particularly in urban areas. The housing crisis became especially acute. Many new arrivals ended up concentrated in suburban areas with limited resources, leading to what Anderson described as parallel societies or two worlds, with unemployment soaring in these areas. As of 2023, the unemployment rate among immigrants was 15.1%, compared to 2.9% for native Swedes in the same age group. In other words, immigrants lived in a world while indigenous lived in another world in the same Sweden. This wasn't because of racism or anything. Unlike some countries that require immigrants to adapt to the host culture, Sweden embraced multiculturalism. It emphasized people's rights to preserve their own cultures and languages in schools and public institutions. It is normal human nature for people to associate with people they have something in common with, and it was this design in human psychology that led to what you could call the two worlds in Sweden. While well-intentioned, this policy resulted in immigrant communities remaining isolated from mainstream Swedish society, hindering integration. And when you're far away from home, some vices are bound to brew and lead to things going wrong. This leads us to perhaps the most contentious reason Sweden is closing its doors. The crime rates are rising, particularly gang-related violence among immigrants. While overall crime rates in Sweden remain relatively low by international standards, certain types of crimes saw significant increases. Gun violence, for instance, has quadrupled over the years. For example, in 2010, Sweden recorded just about 25 fatal shootings, but in 2023, there were 363 shootings, with 53 of them being fatal. And what's particularly troubling is that immigrants, especially those from certain regions, are overrepresented in these crime statistics. A report by the Swedish Crime Prevention Council found that immigrants were 2.5 times more likely to be registered as crime suspects compared to people with two Swedish-born parents. This does not mean that most immigrants are criminals. In fact, the vast majority are law-abiding. The higher crime rates in Sweden are largely attributed to socioeconomic factors rather than cultural differences. Immigrants often face higher unemployment, lower education levels, and social exclusion, all risk factors for criminal behavior. Sweden's welfare system, once seen as a model for supporting immigrants, has faced strains. The system was designed with the assumption that most adults would work and contribute through taxes. However, the employment rate for foreign-born residents in Sweden is still significantly lower than for native Swedes. This is partly because while most countries allow immigrants with a high level of education that enables them to contribute to technological development and growth of the country, Sweden allowed low-skilled individuals into their country. It didn't help matters that Sweden is a highly developed economy, with less than 5% of jobs suitable for people without any qualification. Most immigrants naturally struggled in the job market. Education remains another major challenge. Swedish schools struggle to accommodate large numbers of students who do not speak Swedish. By 2018, 25% of students in Swedish schools had a foreign background, with some schools in immigrant-heavy areas having over 90% non-native Swedish speakers. In the 2023-2024 school year, the share of students with a foreign background in Swedish primary schools increased to 27%, a slight rise from the 25% recorded in 2018. It poses significant challenges for this group with a migration background to achieve academic success and integrate into Swedish society. The combination of education, high welfare costs, low integration, and even lower tax contributions from a significant portion of the migrant population strained Sweden's generous social programs. It also fueled resentment among some native Swedes who felt the system was being abused. All these factors together created a perfect storm of social and economic challenges. Therefore, faced with increasing public pressure and struggling to effectively address these issues, the Swedish government had to implement drastic changes in its immigration policy. Since 2022, the new government of Sweden has been implementing reforms and overhauling its previous immigration policy. The country now makes obtaining asylum much harder, cracks down on illegal immigration, and restricts low-skilled labor immigration. Sweden now requires integration efforts, like learning Swedish, as a condition for long-term stay and welfare benefits. That is how they were able to have just 95,214 immigrants enter in 2023, the lowest number they've had since 2005, except during COVID years. These changes mark a radical departure from Sweden's previous policies. The once famous humanitarian superpower has transformed almost overnight. Sweden today looks starkly different from just a few years ago. Its welcoming stance has been replaced by restrictive, demanding policy. For now, their era as a haven for immigrants seems to have ended, with no signs of returning to its former approach.